What's up, guys? Welcome to Metal Vibes, and today we're going to be ranking the albums of the Swedish death metal legends, Dismember. What can be said about Dismember that hasn't already been said? They're probably the most influential Swedish death metal band behind Entombed, and after years of waiting, their music is finally back on streaming services, so I thought, what better time to rank the band's discography. For some quick background on Dismember, they were formed in 1988. Several of the members were involved in the Swedish death metal band Carnage, and after that band would release their debut, Dismember's lineup would stabilize in 1990, and Dismember would then release their debut album, Like an Ever-Flowing Stream, in 1991 via Nuclear Blast Records. Like an Ever-Flowing Stream is obviously just a legendary album. Like Entombed's Left Hand Path, this is a foundational album for Swedish death metal. And just like that album, this has an infamous opening track. On Left Hand Path, it was the title track. Here it is the song Override of the Overture, and I think an argument can be made that this song is one of the greatest death metal songs of all time. That main riff in this track is just absolutely iconic, and then from there you just have amazing riff after amazing riff strung together in such a way that just feels incredible. It's just the epitome of a well-written death metal song. Like that song, this album as a whole has earned its place in the annals of death metal history. But I do have to say, while this may seem like sacrilege, I'm actually not the hugest fan of this album. I do like it, I do enjoy it, but I think it's got a little bit of first track syndrome. I think Override the Overture is such a good song that the other tracks just don't always match up. What's interesting about this album is you have really developed songs like Override of the Overture and the song Dismembered, but then you have other shorter kind of pummeling tracks that to me are really heavy, but just aren't quite as interesting as those more developed songs. I'm also not a big fan of the production on this album, to be quite honest. I normally don't mind that Sunlight Studios HM2 overdriven sound, but here the album just feels almost overbearingly heavy to me. The guitars just sound so bassy and overdriven that at times it just almost actually inhibits my enjoyment a little bit. I do love the melody that's incorporated in this album, but I feel like the melodies that are incorporated sometimes just feel a little abrupt in how they're incorporated into the songs. I think Dismember would get better at integrating melody into their songs later in their career. This was the first Dismember album I heard, and while I've always enjoyed it, I don't think I've enjoyed it as much as other people have. I understand why it's legendary, and I do think it has some good songs on it. I also like vocalist Matti Karki's Strained Holler. I think that's kind of a unique approach to death metal vocals that you didn't hear from a lot of his peers. And it definitely has a lot of youthful inspiration to it as well. I don't hate the album by any means. It's just not my favorite Dismember album. I'll put it in the middle of their discography. I think they would release better albums, but I think there is a reason Like an Ever-Flowing Stream is considered a classic album, certainly. Alright, so the band would follow up Like an Ever-Flowing Stream in 1993 with the album Indecent and Obscene. So this was apparently named after some circumstances that took place following the release of Like an Ever-Flowing Stream. The song Skin Her Alive on that album resulted in some litigation in the UK for being indecent and obscene. Dismember would ultimately prevail, but they would name their next album Indecent and Obscene, kind of as a bit of a joke, I guess. For a while, I wasn't really keen on checking this album out. I've never really liked gore-themed lyrics or gore-themed albums, and it's not that it bothers me, I just don't find that a particularly engaging lyrical topic. So with this kind of cover and this kind of a album name, I was always put off on this album a little bit, but honestly, I wish I would have checked it out sooner, because I feel like this album, and not Like an Ever-Flowing Stream, should be considered the band's signature album. To me, this just improves in almost every way on the debut. This to me is more aggressive, the riffs sound more fresh, the riffs sound more interesting, and this songwriting feels better. It feels like the melodic portions and the more brutal portions are just integrated together better. It's also got more groove to it, and it's just a catchier album overall, while still feeling like it has really developed and interesting compositions. I think you hear that right from the early tracks like Fleshless and Skinfather. here, which have these awesome stop-start riffs and then the melodic riffs that just feel really fresh, even more fresh, I would say, than the melodies on the previous album. Sorrow-Filled has a huge groovy riff. Soul Devourer is another really cool song. It's got a fast winding riff that almost sounds like something you'd hear from like Angel Corpse. Whereas the production on the last album I felt was a little overbearing. Here, I don't think this album has that problem at all. It's got a pretty raw production, but still heavy and still kind of atmospheric as well, which I like. The one quibble I have about this album is I think the final track, Dreaming in Red, is a little overrated. It seems to be one of Dismember's most popular songs, and I can understand why. It's got some cool ideas in it, but I think between a really interesting intro where you have a kind of a bass melody with a reflective solo and a pretty cool outro, which is like melodic doom metal, between those two portions, it kind of just feels like typical Dismember to me. Well, I think this song has cool ideas. I just don't think I quite enjoy it as much as other people seem to. That being said, that's pretty much the only criticism I have about this album. This album is just absolutely incredible to me. An excellent death metal album, must listen for fans of the genre in my book. It just feels very alive. The compositions just feel very natural. There's so much standout material. And yeah, overall, I would say my favorite Dismember album. Alright, so the band would follow up Indecent and Obscene in 1995 with the album Massive Killing Capacity. This to me kind of feels a bit like a refinement of the last album, whereas the last album felt like it had pretty intricate compositions at times. This one feels like it strips those back a bit and gives you kind of more straightforward songs. Straightforward songs on an album can kind of go either way to me. They can be really good and direct, or they can kind of fall flat, and I think what helps them succeed is some really strong ideas. And fortunately, I think Massive Killing Capacity has those strong ideas. The title track, for example, has this fantastic tremolo riff and this really galloping feel to it. On Frozen Fields has almost a mournful sounding tremolo riff and some really great songwriting. To the Bone is an awesome song. You got a nice melodic riff and some really vicious chugs along with a fast groove. Dismember's drummer, Fred Etzby, has said the band always tries to make sure they incorporate hooks in their music, and I think you can really hear that here. It's always great when a band can balance that brutality with catchiness, and I think Dismember arguably does it better than any other band, and I think this album is where you really see that in full force. It's also interesting because this album is, I would say, far more melodic than like an Ever-Flowing Stream or Indecent and Obscene were, particularly the song Collection by Blood, which basically to me sounds like a melodic death metal song, and a fantastic one at that. This is probably my favorite Dismember song. The riffs are kind of simple, but the way they build up and the way the song is constructed, and just with how catchy the riffs are, just makes it an outstanding track to me. That track is also followed by Casket Garden, which is kind of a slower song with some really powerful melodic grooves, and I think the 1-2 punch of those two songs later in the track list really makes this a great album. I also like the way this album is constructed. You got an instrumental track, Nina, which is the second to last song, and then the closing track, Life, Another Shape of Sorrow, I just think works really well in ending the album on a high note. There are a couple moments on here that hold it back a little for me, and I feel like Indecent and Obscene just felt like it had a little more depth to it. But in terms of straightforward, excellent death metal songs with a very melodic edge, I don't think you can get much better than Massive Killing Capacity. This is an incredible album, and I would say better than the debut in my book. Alright, so Dismember would follow up Massive Killing Capacity in 1997 with the album Death Metal. So the band's label Nuclear Blast was apparently pressuring them to change their style with this album. The band vehemently refused, and as kind of a middle finger to the label, named their album Death Metal. Stylistically, this definitely feels like a continuation of the last album. You have a lot of really fresh and melodic ideas here, and some more great songs. I particularly love the opening track, Of Fire. Trend Killer is another fun track. Misanthropic and Killing Compassion are both really cool songs with some frantic melodic riffs. And then you have Stillborn Ways and Mistweaver, which kind of slow things down a bit and almost have kind of autopsy vibes. I don't necessarily find the slower stuff as gripping, but I think it's nice to have a little bit of variety. I'll also say about death metal that some of the songs on the second half sound a little bit more like the band's early material. And while that's not necessarily bad, I just find those songs a little less interesting here. And so because of that, I think this album is a little backloaded to me. There's a lot of great stuff here, but I think in terms of their albums, I like this a little bit less than the first three albums. So I will put it just behind like an Ever-Flowing Stream. Still a great album, but not quite at the level as the first three albums. All right, so that brings us to 2000 with the album Hate Campaign. I have to say the skull on the cover of this album kind of reminds me of Frank from Donnie Darko, but without the ears. Donnie Darko wouldn't come out until the following year, so I don't think that was what they were influenced by, but it always has amused me nonetheless. Should also mention at this point that Dismember have always had an incredibly consistent lineup. On their first 4 albums, they had all the same members. Hate Campaign was actually the first album where they had a lineup shift. Guitarist Rob Senneback left the band prior to Hate Campaign's recording. He was replaced by Magnus Sahlgren, who's probably best known for his session work with Lake of Tears and Tiamat. He actually wrote several of the songs on this album, so it is kind of cool that they gave a new member the opportunity to do that. This again continues in the vein of the last 2 albums, but I think with Hate Campaign, the riffs and songs just generally aren't quite as good as those albums. Retaliate, for example, has a melodic feel similar to the 2 prior albums, but just isn't quite on the same level. A song like Mutual Animosity is fine, but it almost sounds like kind of a dull crust punk song to me, and it just doesn't really stand out that much. There's definitely a bit more of a thin production job on this album, which I think just makes it sound a little weaker. There is some good stuff here for sure. I like Suicidal Revelations and Enslaved to Bitterness, which both sound like fast melodic death metal songs. Patrol 17 is a cool track, and then the closing title track is pretty cool. Again, a slower song, kind of reminds me of Autopsy, but it's got a great solo and some good riffs, and I think overall it's a good way to end the album. This is hardly a bad album, although I do see it frequently ranked as their worst, and I do think that's fair, but I think it's probably a testament to how great Dismember are that even what's widely considered their worst album, I would say is still better than 90% of the new death metal coming out today. And I say that as a fan of a lot of stuff coming out today. Alright, so Dismember would return in 2004 with the album Where Iron Crosses Grow. So quite a few changes with this album. Magnus Sahlgren would not return for this album, which left the band with only one guitarist, their founding guitarist and sole constant guitarist, David Blomqvist. They also shifted from Nuclear Blast to Carmageddon Records with this album, and they shifted their sound a bit too. This album definitely goes back to a bit of a heavier sound, kind of like the early stuff. Going along with that heftier feel, you have some deeper vocals from Matt, which I think is kind of a cool evolution. Obviously, there was a 4-year gap between this album and Hate Campaign, but I think that time really paid off because the band came back here with some absolutely amazing tracks. I particularly love Forged from Hate, which opens with the sound of a gun cocking. It has a really melodic chorus, but it has a heavier and more aggressive feel than any of the band's prior melodic songs, which I think makes for a really cool cut. Chasing the Serpent stands out as well with some of those stop-start riffs that you heard on Indecent and Obscene and Massive Killing Capacity. Then you have more melodic songs like Tragedy of the Faithful, which has this final passage that just has this bouncy headbangable riff with these harmonized guitars and ultimately makes for, I think, one of the best segments of music in the band's career. I absolutely love that song. I also like the shift to the war-themed lyrics with this album. I kind of like that the band felt free to explore multiple different lyrical themes throughout their career. I think that ultimately made them a little bit more interesting in my book. Not everything here is amazing. I think the song Children of the Cross is a little bit dull, but to me, this is another fantastic album. I would say it's almost equal to death metal and Like an Ever-Flowing Stream, but I think I'll actually put it just below Like an Ever-Flowing Stream and just above death metal. These albums are all really close to me, but I feel pretty good about that ranking. I'll also separate these out a bit and move death metal down to a lower tier, which I think is fair because I think death metal is a little front-loaded, so I think Almost a Total Banger is a good description for that album. Alright, so that brings us to 2006 with the album The God That Never Was. They got a new guitarist for this album, Martin Persson. They also shifted their sound a little bit more with this album. This feels even heavier and more aggressive than the last album did. At the same time, they haven't forgotten to use those melodic moments. So I think that makes for a really cool combination because you have some really hefty moments here, but also some really melodic cuts as well. And I think it ultimately makes for a really strong album because not only is this album consistent, but it has great tracks, and it just shows the band doing the heavier stuff really well and the more melodic stuff really well and integrating it all so well together. The opening title track is a really cool, energetic way to open the album. It almost reminds me a bit of the metallic hardcore / entombed core bands that would crop up in the early 2010s with just how short and pummeling it is. Then you have the more melodic stuff like Time Heals Nothing, which has these tremolo riffs that have a lot of character to them, and then some really rich melodies in the chorus and some rich harmonies as well. Trail of the Dead has a nice headbangable stomp to it, and then the closing track, Where No Ghost Is Holy, is possibly one of the best songs in the band's career. The melodies, again, are just really rich, really frantic, and just really wild. The riffs on this song are just absolutely insane. The soloing is just absolutely insane, and it ultimately makes for, I think, one of the band's best closing tracks. Again, this is a really well-rounded album. I love the instrumental track that appears on here. I think it's really well placed, and I think it really brings the album together. In terms of where I'd rank this, I actually consider this almost equal with albums like Death Metal, Where Iron Crosses Grow, and Like an Ever-Flowing Stream. I think this and those three albums are all really, really close, but I actually think I like this a little bit more than the debut, so I'm going to put it at the same tier as Massive Killing Capacity because I think it deserves it. A really strong effort late in the band's career and a must-listen for fans of Dismember. Alright, and that brings us to the band's final album, 2008's Dismember, their self-titled album. Drummer Fred Etzby left prior to this album's recording, leaving Maddie and David Blomqvist as the sole constant members remaining. Stylistically, this continues that heftier evolution from the previous two albums, resulting in, I would say, probably the band's heaviest and least melodic album yet. The production here really emphasizes the beefy guitars, the buzzing low tremolos, and Maddie just sounds like a grizzly bear. He's gotten a little bit deeper over the years, and I think this is probably his most brutal performance yet. I think you hear the sound encapsulated really well on the opening track, Death Conquers All, which is a really muscular song with some really mighty riffs, but I think it's not the most memorable, and I would say that kind of is the case for this whole album. You know, Dismember don't really have a bad album, but I would say of all their albums, this is probably the least remarkable. Songs like No Honor in Death and The Hills Have Eyes kind of give you some interesting changes in tempo, but it just feels like stuff that has been done better on the band's prior albums. There definitely are some good cuts here. I like Europa Burns. Under a Blood Red Sky is a really cool track. I like that swirling melody that ends it. Tide of Blood has some great melodies as well, as does To End It All. But, you know, that being said, I can't help but feel that everything that was done on this album was just done a little bit better. And I think Dismember are most interesting when they integrate their more melodic side with their more brutal side. And this album just feels like it veers a little bit more towards the more brutal side, which some people might definitely like, and I totally understand that. But for me personally, it's just not as interesting of a Dismember album as some of their other albums. Still a really good album. I'd probably give it a 7 or a strong 6 out of 10 if I was rating it. But in terms of their discography, I would actually say I enjoy Hate Campaign a little bit more than this album because I think Hate Campaign is a little shorter and I think it's got more standout tracks. So I will put the self-titled album as my least favorites. Overall, what a great discography this band has. You know, bands like Entombed, I think, have become legendary. But when you see people talk about that band, they really focus on the first two albums, maybe Wolverine Blues. With Dismember, they've continued releasing great material. Even my least favorite album, their self-titled, is still better than a lot of death metal you hear coming out today. This band just continued releasing great material from the time they formed until they split up, which they did in 2011, unfortunately. However, Dismember would reform in 2019 with their original lineup from the first 4 albums. They were able to play a few shows. COVID posed a little bit of an obstacle to that, which prevented us from seeing them in the US at Maryland Death Fest. But hopefully we'll be able to see them in the US at some point in the future. And they've left open the possibility of recording a new album as well, which would be awesome to hear because, as the band has shown, even late in their career, they're capable of producing some really great stuff. But that does it for this video, guys. Let me know in the comments what you think of Dismember and how you would rank their albums. And if you like this video, please subscribe. Please drop me a like. And if you want to see me talk about more death metal, check out this video over here where I rank the albums of the death metal band Aborted. But that'll do it for this one. I will see you guys next time. Stay heavy.